Sometimes the most powerful friendships begin in the most heartbreaking places. When 6-year-old Ivy walked into that dusty auction house in 1887, she had no idea she was witnessing one of humanity's darkest moments. The desert town of Copper Creek held a terrible secret. They were auctioning off people like cattle, trading human dignity for a handful of coins. Among the crowd stood an elderly Apache warrior named Running Wolf, bound to a wheelchair, his spirit crushed but not broken. While grown men bid on his labor like he was livestock, little Ivy saw something different. She saw a lonely old man who reminded her of her grandfather. With 2 crumpled dollars from her penny jar, she raised her small hand and shocked everyone. In that room, the townspeople laughed, thinking it was just a child's game. But when Ivy started visiting Running Wolf every day, bringing him wildflowers and asking him to tell her stories, something magical happened. This broken warrior began to heal, and this innocent child learned truths about courage and friendship that would change her life forever. What ancient wisdom did Running Wolf share with Ivy that turned a cruel town's shame into a story of hope? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered adobe buildings of Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, where the desert wind carried stories older than the town itself. In 1887, this forgotten outpost existed on borrowed time, sustained by the dying dreams of prospectors and the stubborn hope of families who had nowhere left to go. The copper mines that gave the town its name had played out years ago, leaving behind empty shafts and emptier promises. 6-year-old Ivy Mackenzie stood on the front porch of her mother's boarding house, wearing her father's old sun hat that drooped over her ears like a canvas umbrella. The hat had been Patrick Mackenzie's before the cave-in at the Lucky Strike mine took him along with 7 other men 2 winters past. Now it served as Ivy's shield against the harsh Arizona sun and the harder realities of a world that had grown considerably darker since her father's death. Margaret Mackenzie swept dust from the porch steps with mechanical precision, her movements betraying the weariness that settled deeper into her bones with each passing day. At 32, she had the weathered hands of a woman twice her age and the determined jaw of someone who refused to surrender, despite mounting evidence that surrender might be the sensible choice. The boarding house provided barely enough income to keep them fed, and even that meager security depended on the kindness of travelers who increasingly chose to bypass Copper Creek altogether. "Ivy, come help me with the washing," Margaret called, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had replaced the laughter Ivy remembered from before. The child reluctantly abandoned her post at the porch rail, where she had been watching the morning parade of townspeople making their way to various daily struggles. The boarding house sat on Main Street, which was generous naming for a dusty thoroughfare that connected the general store to the saloon, with stops at the church, the doctor's office, and the livery stable in between. 3 other buildings stood empty, their windows staring blindly at the street like the hollow eyes of abandoned dreams. The Mackenzie boarding house was a 2-story structure that had once been painted white, but now bore the sun-bleached patina of desert survival. Dr. Harold Bennett emerged from his office across the street, medical bag in hand, heading toward the Widow Patterson's place, where her rheumatism had been acting up again. Bennett was a man of 60-odd years who had come west to escape something back east. Nobody asked what, and he never volunteered the information. His gentle manner with patients and his willingness to accept payment in eggs, vegetables, or promises had earned him the quiet respect of Copper Creek's residents. Sheriff Pete Morrison rode slowly down Main Street, his horse kicking up small clouds of dust that settled on everything like fine flour. Morrison was a fair man, trapped in an unfair situation, trying to maintain order in a place where desperation had begun to erode the social contracts that held civilization together. His badge carried less weight each month as the town's resources dwindled and its people grew more desperate. At the far end of Main Street stood the First Baptist Church, where Preacher Williams delivered sermons about God's plan to congregations that grew smaller each Sunday. Williams was a sincere man whose faith had been tested by the harsh realities of frontier life, but had not yet broken. He still believed in redemption, though recent events in Copper Creek were challenging that belief in ways he struggled to articulate. The most substantial building in town was the general store owned by Jacob Fletcher, a shrewd businessman who had managed to profit while others struggled. Fletcher extended credit cautiously and collected debts ruthlessly, understanding that survival often required choices that more prosperous times would never demand. His store served as the unofficial town hall where news was shared, gossip was spread, and difficult decisions were made by men who had run out of easier options. Ivy knew all these people by sight and name, as children in small towns do. She had grown up listening to their conversations, absorbing their concerns, and gradually understanding that the adult world was far more complicated and considerably less fair than the simple moral lessons taught in Sunday school. Her father's death had accelerated this education in ways that robbed her of some childhood innocence, while perhaps preparing her for realities that sheltered children never learned to navigate. The weekly auction was held every Saturday behind Fletcher's store, in a dusty lot that served various community functions throughout the week. What had begun as a practical way for struggling families to sell livestock and belongings had gradually evolved into something more troubling as economic desperation drove people to increasingly desperate measures. It was there, 3 weeks earlier, that Running Wolf had arrived in Copper Creek. Nobody knew exactly how the elderly Apache man had come to be in their town. Bound to a makeshift wheelchair constructed from wagon parts and leather straps. Dr. Bennett had been summoned to examine him and reported that the man appeared to be partially paralyzed from the waist down, though he was responsive and showed no signs of serious illness. He spoke very little English or chose not to speak it, and his presence created an uncomfortable situation for a town that preferred its problems to be familiar ones. Sheriff Morrison had inquired about the man's background, but received only vague answers from the trader who had brought him to town. The trader, a grizzled man named Hutchinson, claimed he had found Running Wolf abandoned near a settlement 2 days' ride south and had brought him to Copper Creek out of Christian charity. The story had holes in it that Morrison recognized, but lacked the resources to investigate properly. What was clear was that Running Wolf needed care, and Copper Creek was not equipped to provide it. The town had no facility for indigent patients, no funds for charitable cases, and no clear legal framework for dealing with displaced Native Americans. Dr. Bennett had provided basic medical attention out of professional obligation, but continuing care would require resources that simply did not exist. Jacob Fletcher had proposed a solution that made economic sense while troubling the consciences of anyone who still possessed one. Running Wolf could be offered at the weekly auction, not as property. That would be slavery, which had been abolished, but as a work contract. Someone could bid for the right to provide him with shelter and care in exchange for whatever labor he might be able to provide. It was legal, practical, and solved the immediate problem of what to do with an elderly, disabled Apache man in a town with no resources to spare. The arrangement troubled Dr. Bennett, who recognized the moral implications even if he could not articulate a practical alternative. Sheriff Morrison understood that the law was being bent rather than broken, which was often the best outcome available in frontier situations where ideal solutions simply did not exist. Preacher Williams struggled to reconcile Christian charity with economic necessity, a challenge that had no easy answers in a world where good intentions were insufficient to solve real problems. Margaret Mackenzie had heard the discussions and felt the familiar weight of moral compromise that seemed to characterize so much of adult decision-making. She understood the practical arguments while recognizing the ethical problems they created. Like most of the town's residents, she found herself hoping that someone else would find a solution that would relieve her of having to choose between conflicting values. Ivy, however, possessed the moral clarity that adults often lose in the process of learning to navigate complex situations. To her 6-year-old understanding, Running Wolf was simply a sad old man who looked lonely and needed a friend. She had noticed him during her walks around town, sitting motionless in his wheelchair outside the livery stable where he had been temporarily housed. She had wanted to approach him, but had been told by her mother that it was not appropriate. A social restriction that made no sense to a child who judged people by simpler criteria. The Saturday auction was approaching, and the entire town seemed to hold its breath while waiting to see how the Running Wolf situation would be resolved. Nobody wanted to bid on him, but nobody wanted to accept responsibility for an alternative solution either. It was a collective failure of courage, disguised as practical necessity, the kind of moral compromise that allows communities to slide gradually away from their stated values while maintaining the fiction that they had no choice. As Ivy helped her mother hang sheets on the clothesline behind the boarding house, she listened to Margaret's worried murmur about money, about the future, about the choices that seemed to grow more difficult each day. The child did not fully understand the economic pressures that drove her mother's concerns, but she recognized the sadness in Margaret's voice and wished there was something she could do to help. In her small room upstairs, Ivy kept a tin can, where she saved pennies and nickels given to her by boarding house guests or earned by doing small chores around town. The can contained 2 crumpled dollar bills and 37 cents. A fortune by 6-year-old standards, though she had no clear plan for how to spend it. She only knew that having money made her feel more secure, more capable of affecting the world around her in some meaningful way. Saturday was only 2 days away, and with it would come the auction that everyone discussed in hushed tones, but nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. Running Wolf sat in his wheelchair outside the livery stable, a human problem that Copper Creek had decided to solve through the morally dubious expedient of treating him like merchandise. The town's residents told themselves they were being practical, but their discomfort with the arrangement suggested they understood exactly what they were really doing. Ivy Mackenzie, wearing her father's oversized hat and carrying her mother's moral teachings, was about to change everything. Saturday morning arrived with the merciless clarity of desert sunlight, exposing the moral bankruptcy that Copper Creek had dressed up as practical necessity. The auction lot behind Fletcher's general store buzzed with an uncomfortable energy, as townspeople gathered for what everyone knew would be an extraordinary event, though nobody wanted to acknowledge exactly what made it extraordinary. Margaret Mackenzie had tried to dissuade Ivy from attending the auction, sensing that a 6-year-old should not witness what was about to unfold. But Ivy had insisted with the stubborn determination that children sometimes display when their moral instincts conflict with adult restrictions, and Margaret lacked the energy to enforce a prohibition she was not entirely sure was justified. Visha makeshift auction platform consisted of wooden crates stacked to create an elevated stage where items for sale could be displayed. Jacob Fletcher served as auctioneer, a role that suited his practical nature and his ability to reduce complex situations to simple economic transactions. A crowd of perhaps 30 people had gathered, more than the usual auction attendance, but fewer than the number who had opinions about what was happening. Dr. Bennett stood near the back of the crowd, his medical bag clutched in his hands as if it might provide some moral authority for the proceedings. Sheriff Morrison positioned himself where he could maintain order if necessary, though he privately hoped that would not be required. Preacher Williams was notably absent, having decided that some compromises were too morally corrosive to witness, even if they could not be prevented. Running Wolf had been brought to the auction in his wheelchair, positioned to one side of the platform like a piece of furniture awaiting evaluation. His weathered face showed no emotion as he observed the crowd that had gathered to determine his immediate future. The leather medicine pouch that hung around his neck seemed to be his only remaining connection to a life that had been systematically stripped away by forces beyond his control. The regular auction items were dispensed with quickly: a plough that needed repair, several chickens, a saddle with cracked leather, and various household goods offered by families who had decided to leave Copper Creek for more promising locations. The crowd's attention remained focused on the unusual business that everyone knew was coming. Fletcher cleared his throat and assumed the false joviality that auctioneers use to make uncomfortable transactions seem routine. Now, folks, we come to a special situation today. As you all know, we have this Apache gentleman, Running Wolf, who needs care and supervision. Dr. Bennett has examined him and reports that he's in reasonable health despite his condition. A murmur ran through the crowd as people shifted uncomfortably. Everyone understood what was happening, but hearing it articulated in Fletcher's matter-of-fact tone made the moral implications impossible to ignore. "I want to be clear," Fletcher continued. "This is not a sale of a person. That would be illegal and wrong. This is a contract arrangement for care and whatever work the gentleman might be able to provide. The winning bidder takes responsibility for his shelter, food, and medical needs." Sheriff Morrison nodded his approval of Fletcher's careful language, though both men understood they were passing legal distinctions that did little to change the fundamental nature of what was occurring. Margaret Mackenzie felt her stomach tighten as she watched Running Wolf's impassive face. The old Apache man stared straight ahead, neither acknowledging the crowd nor protesting his treatment. His dignity remained intact, even as his circumstances reduced him to the status of a problem requiring an economic solution. Ivy stood beside her mother, her small hand gripping the $2 bills in her pocket. She had brought her entire savings to the auction without any clear plan, driven by an instinct she could not articulate but felt compelled to obey. The sight of Running Wolf sitting alone in his wheelchair, surrounded by a crowd of people discussing him as if he were not present, sparked something in her young heart that demanded action. "Do I hear an opening bid of $5? Fletcher called out, his voice carrying forced cheerfulness that fooled nobody. Silence stretched across the auction lot like a held breath. Nobody wanted to be the first to bid, though several people had privately acknowledged that Running Wolf might provide useful labor despite his physical limitations. The moral weight of the moment pressed down on the assembled crowd like the desert heat. "Come now, folks," Fletcher urged. $5 for a year's contract. The gentleman appears to be skilled with his hands, and Dr. Bennett says he's responsive and cooperative. More uncomfortable silence. Margaret Mackenzie looked around at her neighbors and saw the same moral struggle reflected in their faces that she felt in her own heart. Everyone understood the practical arguments, but nobody wanted to be the person who turned those arguments into action. Running Wolf remained motionless in his wheelchair, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. The medicine pouch rose and fell gently with his breathing, the only sign that he was a living person rather than a piece of auction inventory. $3 then, Fletcher said, lowering his starting price. "Surely someone can see the value in $2. The voice cut through the auction chatter like a knife through silence, high and clear and completely unexpected. Every head turned toward the sound, searching for the bidder who had finally broken the moral deadlock. Ivy Mackenzie stood with her small hand raised high above her head, clutching 2 crumpled dollar bills that represented her entire fortune. Her father's oversized hat cast a shadow across her face, but her eyes blazed with the righteous determination that sometimes moves children to act when adults have talked themselves into paralysis. $2, she repeated, her voice carrying. Across the stunned auction lot with crystal clarity, the crowd erupted in confused murmurs, nervous laughter, and whispered consultations about what exactly was happening. Margaret Mackenzie felt her heart stop as she realized what her daughter had done. reaching instinctively to pull Ivy back while simultaneously feeling a surge of pride at the child's moral courage. Fletcher stared at the small girl in bewilderment, his auctioneer's patter completely disrupted by this unexpected development. He looked toward Sheriff Morrison for guidance about whether a 6-year-old could legally participate in such a transaction. Running Wolf turned his head slowly toward Ivy, and for the first time since his arrival in Copper Creek, something flickered in his dark eyes. The old Apache warrior studied the small girl with the serious attention that adults rarely accorded children, as if he were seeing something in her that the rest of the crowd had missed. "Ivy." "No," Margaret whispered, but her daughter remained, standing with her hand raised, her jaw set, with the same stubborn determination that had characterized her father. "She can't bid," someone in the crowd protested. "She's just a child. Her money's as good as anyone else's," another voice countered, though the speaker seemed uncertain about the appropriateness of the situation. Fletcher looked around helplessly, his carefully planned auction completely derailed by a 6-year-old's moral intervention. The legal aspects of the situation were unclear, but the emotional impact was undeniable. Ivy's bid had exposed the fundamental cruelty of the entire proceeding, while simultaneously offering a solution that nobody had anticipated. Dr. Bennett stepped forward from the back of the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of his professional position. "The child's bid is legitimate," he said quietly. $2 for a care contract. I don't see any legal impediment." Sheriff Morrison nodded reluctantly, understanding that the law provided no clear guidance for such an unusual situation, but recognizing that refusing the bid would require explanations that might be more troubling than accepting it. $2, Fletcher repeated weakly, his auctioneer's confidence completely shattered. "Do I hear $2 going once?" he continued, looking around at a crowd that had been shocked into silence by a child's simple act of compassion. "Going twice." Running Wolf's eyes remained fixed on Ivy, and the faintest suggestion of a smile touched the corners of his weathered mouth. "Sold to the young lady for $2. The auction lot fell silent, except for the whisper of desert wind through the gathered crowd. Ivy Mackenzie, 6 years old and wearing her father's hat, had just purchased the friendship of an Apache warrior with her saved pennies, though she did not yet understand that what she had really bought was her own education in the complexities of justice, mercy, and the courage required to act when action is the only moral choice available. Margaret Mackenzie pulled her daughter close, torn between horror at what Ivy had done and pride at why she had done it. The crowd began to disperse in small groups, their conversations subdued as they processed what they had witnessed. Running Wolf remained in his wheelchair, but something fundamental had changed in his posture. For the first time in months, he was no longer alone. The morning after the auction found Ivy Mackenzie standing outside the livery stable at dawn, her father's hat secured against the desert breeze and a handful of wildflowers clutched in her small fist. She had awakened with the sun, driven by an urgency she could not explain but felt compelled to obey. Margaret had tried to convince her daughter to wait until a more reasonable hour, but Ivy's determination had proven stronger than her mother's exhausted protests. Running Wolf sat in his wheelchair exactly where she had left him the previous evening, positioned near the stable's entrance where the morning light would eventually reach him. His eyes were open, staring toward the distant mountains with an expression that suggested he had been awake for some time. The medicine pouch around his neck caught the early sunlight, its worn leather surface telling stories that Ivy was only beginning to imagine. "Good morning," she said in the careful, formal voice that children use when they are trying to act grown up. "I brought you flowers." Running Wolf turned his head slowly toward her, his weathered face showing no immediate reaction to her presence. Ivy had expected him to smile, perhaps to thank her for the flowers, but his silence stretched on until she began to wonder if he had understood her words. She approached his wheelchair with the cautious steps of someone entering unfamiliar territory, holding the wildflowers out like a peace offering. Up close, Running Wolf appeared even older than he had seemed from a distance, his face lined with years of experience that Ivy could not begin to comprehend. His dark eyes held depths that reminded her of the deep wells that some of the town's residents had dug in search of water. You could look down into them for a long time without reaching the bottom. "These are for you," she said again, extending the flowers with patient determination. Running Wolf studied the small bouquet for several moments before slowly reaching out to accept it. His hands, Ivy noticed, were surprisingly gentle as they took the flowers from her grasp. He examined each bloom carefully, as if he were reading meanings in their colors and shapes that she had never considered. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of gravel and distant thunder. The words were carefully pronounced, each syllable given equal emphasis in the manner of someone speaking a language that was not their first. Ivy felt a surge of triumph at having elicited a response, followed immediately by uncertainty about what to do next. She had not planned beyond the flower delivery, operating on pure instinct rather than any coherent strategy for building a friendship with an elderly Apache warrior. "Oh, what's that?" she asked, pointing to the medicine pouch around his neck. Running Wolf's hand moved instinctively to protect the pouch, his fingers closing around it with the reflexive care of someone guarding something precious. "Sacred things," he said after a long pause. "From my people." The words hung in the morning air between them, heavy with implications that Ivy sensed but could not yet understand. She had heard adults speak of Indians in various ways, sometimes with fear, sometimes with contempt, occasionally with pity. But Running Wolf's simple statement about sacred things carried a dignity that none of those adult perspectives had prepared her to recognize. "My mama says you're Apache," Ivy said, settling cross-legged in the dust beside his wheelchair with the casual acceptance of childhood that ignores social boundaries adults have learned to respect. "Yes," Running Wolf confirmed, his eyes returning to the distant mountains. "Apache." For several minutes, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher above the desert landscape. Ivy found herself studying Running Wolf's profile, noting the proud line of his jaw and the way his eyes seemed to be seeing things that were not visible to her. She had expected conversation, perhaps stories, but his quiet presence felt oddly peaceful in a way she had not anticipated. The stable owner, a gruff man named Henderson, emerged from the building carrying a bucket of water and a stale biscuit. He nodded briefly at Ivy before setting both items within Running Wolf's reach, his movements suggesting this had become a morning routine. "Your breakfast," Henderson said without warmth, his tone making it clear that providing basic sustenance was a duty rather than an act of kindness. Running Wolf nodded his thanks, but made no move toward the food. After Henderson had returned to his duties inside the stable, Ivy ventured another question. "Are you hungry?" Running Wolf looked at the biscuit with little enthusiasm. "Always hungry," he said, but his tone suggested he was referring to something deeper than physical nourishment. Ivy considered this response with the seriousness that children sometimes bring to adult statements they do not fully comprehend. She had been hungry before. When money was particularly tight at the boarding house, meals sometimes became smaller and less frequent, but she sensed that Running Wolf's hunger was different from anything she had experienced. "I could bring you better food," she offered. "Mama makes good biscuits and sometimes there's honey." Running Wolf turned to study her with what might have been surprise. "You would do this?" "Yes," Ivy said, with the immediate certainty of childhood decision-making. "Friends share food." The word friends seemed to catch Running Wolf's attention. He repeated it slowly as if testing how it sounded in his mouth. "Friends, that's what we are," Ivy declared with 6-year-old authority. "I bought you at the auction, so now we're friends." Running Wolf's expression grew thoughtful at this explanation of their relationship. After a long moment, he reached into a leather bag that hung from his wheelchair and withdrew a small object that he had been carving. It was a wooden horse, no larger than Ivy's palm, carved with surprising detail, despite the limitations imposed by his seated position. "For you," he said, offering the carving with the same careful ceremony that she had used to present the flowers. Ivy accepted the wooden horse with reverence, turning it over in her hands to examine the intricate details. The mane had been carved with individual strands, and the horse's legs were positioned as if it were in mid-gallop, frozen in a moment of perfect motion. "You made this?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "With my hands," Running Wolf confirmed, flexing his fingers to demonstrate their continued functionality despite his physical limitations. "It's beautiful," Ivy breathed, cradling the carving against her chest. "I'll keep it forever." Something shifted in Running Wolf's expression at these words, a subtle softening that suggested her promise had touched something deep within him. For the first time since his arrival in Copper Creek, he looked directly at another person, not as a stranger or potential threat, but as someone who might understand that beneath his broken circumstances lay a human being worthy of respect and capable of friendship. Margaret Mackenzie appeared at the end of the street, having finally tracked down her missing daughter. She approached the stable with the mixture of relief and exasperation that mothers feel when they discover their children safe, but in unauthorized locations. "Ivy, you can't just disappear like that," Margaret scolded gently, though her tone carried more concern than anger. "I was visiting with Running Wolf," Ivy explained, holding up the wooden horse as evidence of their successful interaction. "He made this for me." Margaret looked at the carving and then at Running Wolf, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since his arrival in town. Instead of the burden she had previously perceived, she saw an elderly man who had taken the time to create something beautiful for her daughter, despite having every reason to feel bitter about his treatment by the community. "Thank you," she said to Running Wolf, her voice carrying genuine gratitude. "That was very kind of you." Running Wolf nodded solemnly. "The child has a good heart," he said, "like her father's hat, too big for her head, but she will grow into it." The observation surprised Margaret with its insight, suggesting that Running Wolf had been observing their family more carefully than anyone had realized. She found herself looking at him with new eyes, seeing not just the disabled Apache man who had become the town's unwanted problem, but a person with perceptions and wisdom that might be worth understanding. "Come along, Ivy," Margaret said finally. "We need to get breakfast started for the boarders." As they walked away from the livery stable, Ivy clutching her wooden horse and already planning her next visit, Running Wolf watched them go with something that might have been contentment. For the first time in months, he had a reason to look forward to tomorrow. 3 weeks into their unusual friendship, Ivy had established a routine that revolved around daily visits to Running Wolf at the livery stable. Each morning, after helping her mother with breakfast preparations, she would make her way through a town with whatever small gift she had managed to procure, sometimes leftover biscuits from the boarding house kitchen, occasionally wildflowers, or simply her presence and endless questions about his life before Copper Creek. Running Wolf had begun to anticipate these visits with something approaching eagerness, though he maintained the stoic demeanor that seemed as natural to him as breathing. The wooden horse had been followed by other small carvings: an eagle with outstretched wings, a bear standing on its hind legs, a buffalo with its head lowered for grazing. Each piece demonstrated a skill that suggested years of practice and an artistic sensibility that transcended his current circumstances. On this particular morning, Ivy carried a faded photograph that she had discovered among her father's belongings. While helping Margaret organize their meager possessions, the image showed a much younger Running Wolf in what appeared to be a military uniform, standing alongside several other men in front of an American flag. "Is this you?" she asked, without preamble. Holding the photograph up for his inspection, Running Wolf's reaction was immediate and profound. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he accepted the photograph, and his eyes took on a distant quality that suggested he was seeing far more than the simple image before him. "Yes," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the mourning. A desert wind. Long time ago. Different world. Ivy waited patiently while he studied the photograph, sensing that this discovery had opened something in him that required careful handling. She had learned over the past weeks that Running Wolf's stories came slowly, like water from a reluctant well, and that pushing too hard would cause him to retreat into silence. "You were a soldier," she observed, settling into her customary position. Beside his wheelchair. "Scout," Running Wolf corrected, his fingers tracing the outline of his younger self in the photograph. "I showed the army where to find water, where to find safe passage through the mountains. I helped them understand the land." The simple statement carried weights that Ivy could sense but not fully comprehend. She knew enough about the conflicts between Indians and white settlers to understand that Running Wolf's role as a scout placed him in a complicated position between two worlds, but the full implications of that complexity remained beyond her 6-year-old grasp. "Why did you help them?" she asked, with the directness that children bring to questions that adults might consider too sensitive to voice. Running Wolf was quiet for such a long time that Ivy began to wonder if he had chosen not to answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of decades of doubt and regret. "My family was hungry," he said. "My children needed food, medicine. The army promised these things if I helped them. I thought I could serve my people by serving their needs." He paused, looking toward the mountains that rose beyond Copper Creek, like ancient guardians watching over the desert floor. "I was wrong. About many things." The photograph showed other men in similar uniforms, and Ivy pointed to them with curiosity. "Who are they?" "Other scouts. Other men who believed promises that were not kept." Running Wolf's voice carried a bitterness that Ivy had not heard before. "Some were good men, trying to help their families survive. Some were fools who thought they could become white by wearing white man's clothes." "Which were you?" Ivy asked, with the fearless honesty that adults rarely displayed. Running Wolf looked at her with something that might have been admiration for her directness. "Both," he said after consideration. "A good man and a fool. Sometimes it is possible to be both things at the same time." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Bennett, who had taken to checking on Running Wolf's condition periodically since the auction. Bennett's medical examinations had revealed that Running Wolf's paralysis was not as complete as initially believed. He retained some sensation and limited movement in his legs, but the psychological trauma associated with his condition seemed as significant as the physical limitations. "Good morning, Ivy," Dr. Bennett said warmly, setting his medical bag on the ground beside Running Wolf's wheelchair. "I see you've brought our friend another gift." "It's a picture of him when he was young," Ivy explained, showing the photograph to Dr. Bennett. "He was a soldier scout." Bennett examined the photograph with professional interest, noting the details of uniforms and equipment that provided clues about when and where it might have been taken. "This appears to be from a cavalry unit," he observed, "probably 15 or 20 years ago, judging by the uniforms." Running Wolf nodded confirmation. "Fort Apache. I served there for 7 years." The information surprised Dr. Bennett, who had not realized the extent of Running Wolf's military service. "You were discharged with honor?" "Yes," Running Wolf said, though his tone suggested that honor had proven to be a complicated concept. "Medal for bravery when we rescued settlers from raiders. Paper saying I was good soldier who served his country well." The irony was not lost on Dr. Bennett, who recognized that a man honored for military service should not have ended up in a wheelchair at a frontier auction, reduced to dependence on the charity of a 6-year-old child. "Where are those papers now?" Bennett asked, his medical mind beginning to consider the broader implications of Running Wolf's background. "Lost," Running Wolf said simply. "Many things were lost when I became sick, when I could no longer take care of myself. Papers do not matter when you cannot walk, cannot work, cannot provide for yourself. Ivy listened to this exchange with growing indignation, her sense of justice offended by the idea that someone who had served his country could be abandoned in his time of need. Her understanding of military service came primarily from stories about her father's brief stint in the territorial militia, but those stories had always emphasized the honor and respect that came with such service. "That's not fair," she declared, with the moral clarity that adults often lost in the complexity of real-world circumstances. "No," Running Wolf agreed, looking at her with something approaching a smile. "It is not fair. But fairness is a luxury that not everyone can afford." Dr. Bennett completed his examination and prepared to leave, but paused to address Running Wolf with uncharacteristic directness. "If you still have friends from your military service, they might be able to help with your situation. Veterans sometimes look out for each other." Running Wolf shook his head slowly. "Most are dead. The others have their own problems. Old soldiers are forgotten soldiers, Doctor. The country moves on to new wars, new heroes. Yesterday's scouts become today's problems." After Dr. Bennett had left, Ivy remained with Running Wolf in contemplative silence. The photograph had opened a window into his past that revealed the depth of loss he had experienced, but it had also shown her that he had once been a man of importance and respect. The contrast between his former status and current circumstances troubled her in ways she struggled to articulate. "I'm sorry you lost your family," she said finally, the words carrying the sincere sympathy that children offer without the awkward qualifications that adults often attach to expressions of condolence. "They are with the spirits now," Running Wolf replied. "Safe from hunger, safe from the promises of men who do not keep their word. Sometimes death is kinder than life." The statement chilled Ivy, not because she feared death, but because she recognized the depth of despair it revealed. She had never heard anyone suggest that death might be preferable to life, and the idea challenged her fundamental understanding of the world. "But you're not dead," she pointed out with 6-year-old logic. "You're here with me. That's better than being dead." Running Wolf studied her face with the attention he might have given to tracking signs in the wilderness. "Yes," he said after a long moment, "perhaps it is better. Perhaps the spirits sent me a small friend to remind me of reasons to stay alive." The words warmed Ivy in a way that had nothing to do with the desert sun. She had never thought of herself as someone who could provide reasons for living, but the idea that her friendship might serve such an important purpose filled her with a sense of significance that far exceeded her years. As they sat together in the growing warmth of the morning, Margaret Mackenzie appeared around the corner of the livery stable, her expression showing the mixture of resignation and growing acceptance that had characterized her attitude toward Ivy's daily visits. Over the past weeks, she had observed the positive changes in both her daughter and Running Wolf, and while the situation remained unconventional, she could not deny its beneficial effects. "Good morning, Running Wolf," Margaret said, her tone carrying genuine warmth rather than the polite formality she had initially used. "I hope Ivy hasn't been bothering you with too many questions." "Her questions helped me remember who I was," Running Wolf replied, holding up the photograph that had sparked their morning conversation. "Sometimes remembering is painful, but forgetting is worse." Margaret noticed the photograph and recognized its significance, understanding that Ivy had stumbled upon something important in Running Wolf's history. The image of him in military uniform challenged her preconceptions and forced her to confront the assumptions she had made about his background and circumstances. "You served in the army," she observed, accepting the photograph when Running Wolf offered it for her examination. 7 years, he confirmed. "Good years, mostly. I had purpose then, respect from other soldiers. I helped save lives by knowing the desert, knowing where water could be found, where enemies might hide." Margaret studied the young man in the photograph and compared him to the broken figure before her, recognizing the tragedy of a life that had moved from honor to abandonment, through circumstances beyond his control. Her own experience as a widow, struggling to maintain dignity while facing economic hardship, gave her insight into the ways that life could transform respect into pity, security into dependence. "Those were different times," she said, returning the photograph with the respect it deserved. "All times are different when you live through them," Running Wolf replied, "but some lessons remain the same. Friendship is one of those lessons. Your daughter teaches me this every day." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the direction of Main Street. Through the gaps between buildings, they could see a crowd gathering near the general store, their animated discussions suggesting that some significant news had reached Copper Creek. Margaret felt the familiar anxiety that accompanied unexpected gatherings in a small town where news was usually bad and rarely affected just one family. "I should see what's happening," she said, her protective instincts focusing on potential threats to their precarious stability. "Can Running Wolf come with us?" Ivy asked, looking up at her mother with hopeful eyes. "He never gets to see what's happening in town." Margaret hesitated, recognizing that bringing Running Wolf into the center of town gatherings might expose him to comments and attitudes that would be painful for everyone involved. But she also understood that isolation was its own form of cruelty, and that Running Wolf deserved to be treated as a member of the community rather than a problem to be hidden away. "If he wants to come," she said finally, looking to Running Wolf for his preference. Running Wolf considered the offer carefully, weighing his desire to understand the community's concerns against his awareness that his presence might complicate whatever situation was developing. "Yes," he said after a moment, "I would like to see." Together, the unlikely trio made their way toward Main Street, where the gathering crowd was discussing news that would soon change everything they thought. They knew about Running Wolf's situation and their own community's future. The crowd gathered around Jacob Fletcher's general store, buzzed with the kind of intense conversation that accompanies news of territorial politics reaching isolated frontier communities. A territorial official named Marcus Webb had arrived that morning with documents and questions about recent auction activities, specifically inquiring about the legal status of Native Americans being sold for labor contracts in Copper Creek. Sheriff Morrison stood near the center of the crowd, his expression grim as he attempted to explain the town's economic necessities to a man who clearly viewed their recent auction through the lens of territorial law rather than local desperation. Webb was a thin, officious man in his 40s, whose clean clothes and soft hands marked him as someone unaccustomed to the harsh realities of frontier survival. As Margaret, Ivy, and Running Wolf approached the gathering, conversations became more subdued, and several townspeople turned to stare at Running Wolf with expressions that ranged from curiosity to embarrassment. His presence at the center of their community discussion about his own legal status created an awkward dynamic that nobody seemed prepared to address directly. "There he is," Webb said, when he noticed Running Wolf's wheelchair, his tone carrying the satisfaction of someone who had found the evidence he was seeking. "This is the individual who was sold at auction?" "It wasn't a sale," Sheriff Morrison corrected firmly. "It was a work contract arrangement, completely legal under territorial statutes governing care of indigent persons." Webb consulted a leather portfolio filled with official documents, his bureaucratic manner suggesting that he viewed the situation through regulatory frameworks rather than human considerations. "Nevertheless, the territorial government has received reports about irregularities in how certain populations are being treated in frontier communities." Dr. Bennett stepped forward from the crowd, his medical authority lending weight to his words. "The arrangement has been beneficial for everyone involved. The individual has received regular medical care and proper nutrition, and the child who won the contract has provided companionship that has improved his mental condition significantly." "The child?" Webb asked, his attention shifting to Ivy with obvious surprise. A child won the auction? $2, Ivy announced proudly, apparently unaware of the complex legal implications her successful bid had created. I bought Running Wolf because he looked lonely. Webb stared at the 6-year-old girl as if she represented some category of legal problem he had never encountered in his territorial administrative training. The idea that a child had participated in what he viewed as a questionable labor auction clearly fell outside his prepared framework for handling such situations. Running Wolf had remained silent during the discussion, but Webb's scrutiny prompted him to speak for himself, rather than allowing others to discuss his status as if he were not present. "I am grateful for the child's kindness," he said, his voice carrying the dignity that had impressed everyone who had taken the time to actually listen to him. "She has treated me with more respect than I have received from most white men." Statement created an uncomfortable silence as several townspeople recognized the implicit criticism of their own behavior toward Running Wolf since his arrival. Webb, however, seemed more interested in the legal implications than the moral ones. "What is your full name?" Webb asked, producing a pencil and preparing to take notes. "Joseph Crow Feather," Running Wolf replied, using his English name rather than his Apache designation. "Sergeant Joseph Crow Feather, formerly of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, Fort Apache." The military details caught Webb's attention in a way that the human interest aspects of the situation had not. "You served in the Army. 7 years active duty," Running Wolf confirmed. "Honorably discharged with commendations for meritorious service in tracking and reconnaissance operations." Webb made additional notes, his bureaucratic instincts recognizing that military service created a different category of legal consideration than simple indigent care. "Do you have discharge papers, pension documentation, any official records of your service?" Running Wolf's expression darkened at the question. "Lost when I became ill, when I could no longer care for myself. Many things are lost when a man becomes helpless." Margaret Mackenzie found herself studying Running Wolf with new understanding as more details of his background emerged. The contrast between his former status as a decorated soldier and his current circumstances as the subject of a territorial investigation highlighted the arbitrary nature of the misfortunes that could transform anyone's life from stability to desperation. "The territorial government maintains records of all military discharges," Webb said, making more notes. "If you served with distinction, there should be documentation that could affect your current legal status." "What does that mean?" Ivy asked, with the directness that adults often avoided when discussing sensitive subjects. Webb looked down at the small girl with the expression of someone trying to explain complex legal concepts to an audience incapable of understanding them. "It means that if Running Wolf, Sergeant Crow Feather, is a military veteran with official status, he may be entitled to certain protections and benefits that would make this auction arrangement inappropriate." The implication hung in the air, above the gathered crowd like morning mist, suggesting that their solution to the Running Wolf problem might have been not just morally questionable, but legally problematic as well. Several townspeople began to shift uncomfortably as they realized that their practical compromise might expose them to territorial scrutiny they could not afford. Jacob Fletcher stepped forward with the defensive tone of someone whose business practices were being questioned by outside authority. "We acted in good faith based on the information available to us. The man appeared to be indigent and in need of care. The auction provided a legal framework for addressing his immediate needs." "Perhaps," Webb said, his non-committal tone suggesting that he was not prepared to accept Fletcher's justification without further investigation. "But if Sergeant Crow Feather is entitled to military pension or other veterans' benefits, the territorial government has an obligation to ensure he receives them." Running Wolf listened to this discussion of his potential benefits with the weary expression of someone who had heard similar promises before. "Benefits," he repeated, his tone carrying decades of disappointment. White man's promises are like desert rain, much talk about water, but little reaches the ground. Dr. Bennett recognized the cynicism behind Running Wolf's response and understood its source. Nevertheless, he said, if there are legitimate benefits available, you deserve to receive them. What I deserve and what I receive have been different things for many years, Running Wolf replied. But the child's friendship is real. Her kindness requires no papers, no government approval. Perhaps that is benefit enough. Avi looked up at Running Wolf with the fierce loyalty that children display toward those they have claimed as their own. "You're my friend, no matter what papers say," she declared. "I bought you fair and square, and friends stick together." The simple statement carried more moral authority than all of Webb's territorial regulations, reminding everyone present that beneath the legal complexities lay a relationship built on genuine affection and mutual respect. Webb seemed uncertain how to address this aspect of the situation, his bureaucratic training having prepared him to deal with regulations rather than emotions. As the crowd began to disperse, each person carrying away their own interpretation of the morning's revelations, Running Wolf remained in his wheelchair beside Ivy and Margaret. The territorial investigation had introduced new uncertainties into their relationship, but it had also revealed depths to Running Wolf's background that none of them had previously understood. "Will you have to leave?" Ivy asked with the worried voice of someone who had already experienced the loss of important people in her life. "I do not know," Running Wolf answered honestly. "But today we are still friends, and today is all we can be certain about." Margaret Mackenzie looked at the elderly Apache warrior who had somehow become part of her family's daily routine and realized that she had grown to care about his welfare in ways that went far beyond her daughter's innocent affection. Whatever the territorial investigation revealed, she hoped it would lead to justice rather than another abandonment in a life that had already seen too many broken promises. 3 days after Marcus Webb's visit, Running Wolf began sharing stories that reached deeper into his past than anything he had previously revealed to Ivy or Margaret. The territorial officials' questions about his military service had awakened memories that had been buried beneath layers of pain and disappointment, and something in Ivy's patient attention encouraged him to explore those memories rather than simply enduring them. They sat in their customary spot beside the livery stable, but on this morning Running Wolf had brought out his war paint bowl, a ceramic vessel decorated with symbols that meant nothing to Ivy, but everything to him. The bowl was small enough to fit in his lap, its surface marked with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said, running his fingers along the bowl's rim with reverent care. "He painted his face for ceremony, for war, for speaking with spirits. When he died, he left it to me with the understanding that I would pass it to my son when the time came." Ivy studied the bowl with the respectful attention she had learned. To give to Running Wolf's possessions, recognizing that each item he shared carried significance beyond her immediate comprehension. "What happened to your son?" The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire, heavy with implications that Running Wolf had been avoiding for months. When he finally answered, his voice carried the weight of losses that no parent should have to bear. "Fever took him when he was 8 winters old. Same fever that took my wife, my daughter, my mother. Whole camps died that winter, and the army doctors who promised to help never came." He paused, staring into the painted bowl, as if he could see reflections of faces that existed now only in memory. "I was away, tracking raiders for the cavalry. When I returned to find my family gone, I understood that serving the army had cost me everything that mattered." Ivy felt tears forming in her eyes as she began to understand the depth of Running Wolf's losses. Her own grief over her father's death seemed small in comparison to the wholesale destruction of an entire family, and she struggled to find words that might offer comfort for such overwhelming sorrow. "Is that why you're sad all the time?" she asked with the directness that had characterized all their conversations. Sadness is like winter, Running Wolf replied. It comes when it comes, stays as long as it stays, leaves when it is ready to leave. Fighting it only makes it stronger. Margaret Mackenzie approached from the direction of the boarding house, carrying a basket of fresh bread and a pot of coffee that had become her own contribution to their morning visits. Over the past weeks, she had found herself drawn into their conversations, her own experiences as a widow giving her insight into the ways that loss could reshape a person's relationship with hope. "Good morning," she said, setting the basket within reach and noticing the war paint bowl for the first time. "That's beautiful. May I look at it more closely?" Running Wolf offered the bowl for her inspection, his gesture carrying the trust that had developed between them over their shared concern for Ivy's welfare. Margaret examined the painted symbols with respectful curiosity, recognizing craftsmanship and artistry even though the cultural meanings remained foreign to her understanding. "Your grandfather made this?" "His grandfather made the bowl," Running Wolf corrected. "My grandfather painted the symbols. Each generation adds to the story, passes it along to the next, or was supposed to before the stories ended." The phrase, "stories ended," carried finality that troubled Margaret, suggesting that Running Wolf viewed himself as the conclusion of something rather than its continuation. She had observed similar attitudes in other people who had suffered losses that seemed to close off their connection to the future, and she recognized the danger of such thinking. "Stories don't end," she said with gentle conviction. "They change. They move in new directions, but they don't end as long as someone remembers them." Running Wolf looked at her with something approaching surprise, as if her words had challenged an assumption he had carried for years. "You think so?" "I know so," Margaret replied. "You're telling your stories to Ivy. She'll remember them, carry them forward in her own way. That's how stories survive." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Ivy leaned forward with the eager expression that preceded her most important questions. "Will you tell me about the places you used to live? Before the army, before here?" Running Wolf set the war paint bowl carefully in his lap and began to speak in a different voice than his usual conversational tone. Deeper, more rhythmic, carrying the cadence of someone accustomed to storytelling as both entertainment and education. "We lived where the mountains touched the sky," he began, his eyes focusing on distant points beyond the buildings of Copper Creek. Water ran clear and cold from springs that had never known the taste of white man's cattle. Pine trees grew so tall that eagles built their nests in clouds, and deer paths wound through meadows where grass grew thick as a horse's mane. Using his finger, he began to draw in the dust beside his wheelchair, creating a map of landscapes that existed now only in memory. Mountains appeared as jagged lines, rivers as curved paths, valleys as gentle depressions between elevated areas. "Our summer camp was here," he said, marking a spot with careful precision, "where 3 streams came together to form a larger river. Fish were plentiful, game was easy to hunt, and children could play safely because the spirits watched over that place." Ivy studied the dirt map with fascination, her imagination transforming Running Wolf's simple lines into the rich landscapes he described. "Why did you leave?" "Soldiers came," Running Wolf said simply. "Said we had to move to the reservation, that the government needed our land for settlers. We were promised new land, better land, but promises and truth are not always the same thing." He continued drawing, adding details to his dirt map that illustrated the geography of displacement and loss. "The reservation was here," he said, marking a location far from the original summer camp. "Desert land where nothing grew well, where water was scarce, and game was already hunted out by other tribes who had been moved there earlier." Margaret watched the map taking shape and recognized a story that was being repeated across the American West as territorial expansion displaced indigenous populations in favor of mining, ranching, and agricultural development. Her own family's presence in Arizona represented part of that expansion, a realization that made her uncomfortable in ways she was only beginning to understand. "That's when you joined the army?" she asked. "That's when I became desperate enough to believe that helping the army might help my people," Running Wolf corrected. "I thought if I proved that Apache could be trusted, could be valuable to the government, they might treat us with more respect." The irony in his voice made it clear how that strategy had worked out. Ivy, however, was more interested in the geographical details than the political implications. "Can we visit these places?" she asked, pointing to various locations on the dirt map. Running Wolf's expression grew thoughtful at the question, as if he were considering possibilities that had not occurred to him in years. "Some places, maybe, if my legs remember how to carry me. If the spirits welcome an old fool who tried to serve two masters and failed both." "Your legs are getting stronger," Dr. Bennett's voice announced his arrival, medical bag in hand for his regular examination. "I've noticed improvement in your mobility over the past few weeks." The doctor had been documenting Running Wolf's gradual recovery, noting that regular companionship and purposeful activity seemed to be stimulating both physical and psychological healing in ways that medical intervention alone had not achieved. "You really think he could travel?" Margaret asked, her practical mind immediately focusing on the challenges such a journey would present. "Short distances with proper support," Dr. Bennett confirmed. "The question is whether it would be advisable, given his condition and the uncertainty surrounding his legal status." Running Wolf looked up at the three adults discussing his capabilities as if he were not present, then spoke with quiet authority that commanded attention. "The question is whether I have the courage to revisit places where I was happy, knowing that happiness cannot be recovered." The statement silenced their discussion, reminding everyone that the physical aspects of travel were less challenging than the emotional ones. Running Wolf's journey back to ancestral lands would be a return not just to geographical locations, but to memories of everything he had lost. Ivy, however, approached the idea with 6-year-old optimism, untempered by adult understanding of loss and regret. "We could make new happy memories there," she suggested, "all of us together." Running Wolf looked at the small girl who had become his anchor to hope and realized that she was proposing something more radical than a simple journey. She was suggesting that healing might be possible, that the future could hold something other than endurance of the past's pain. "Yes," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of possibility that had been absent since his arrival in Copper Creek. "Perhaps we could." Marcus Webb returned to Copper Creek on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide Running Wolf's life into before and after. The territorial official arrived with a leather satchel full of documents and an expression that suggested his investigation had uncovered information that would surprise everyone involved. He requested a meeting with Sheriff Morrison, Dr. Bennett, and specifically asked that Running Wolf be present for the discussion. The gathering took place in Dr. Bennett's office, the most neutral location available in a town where every other building carried associations that might complicate the delicate nature of what Webb had discovered. Running Wolf sat in his wheelchair between Ivy and Margaret, who had been included despite Webb's initial protests that the matter might be too complex for civilian involvement. "I've spent the past week in the territorial archives," Webb began, spreading documents across Dr. Bennett's examining table like a lawyer preparing for trial. Sergeant Joseph Crowfeather's military records make for fascinating reading. He lifted a document bearing official seals and signatures, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone reading from governmental records. "Enlisted April 15th, 1869, assigned to 3rd Cavalry Regiment as scout and tracker, participated in 17 major operations against hostile raiders, credited with saving the lives of 43 soldiers and civilians through superior knowledge of terrain and enemy tactics." Running Wolf listened to this recitation of his military service with the detached expression of someone hearing his own obituary read aloud. The achievements Webb described belonged to a different man in a different time, connected to his current circumstances only by the continuity of memory and the persistence of scars both visible and hidden. Webb continued reading from the official records. Awarded the Medal of Honor on June 3, 1875, for extraordinary heroism during the rescue of settlers trapped by Apache raiders in Devil's Canyon. Citation reads, Sergeant Crowfeather voluntarily entered enemy territory alone, located the captured civilians, and guided a rescue force through treacherous terrain under hostile fire, resulting in the successful recovery of 12 men, women, and children who would otherwise have perished. The words hung in the air of Dr. Bennett's office like gunsmoke, their implications slowly settling into the consciousness of everyone present. Ivy looked up at Running Wolf with new eyes, seeing not just her elderly friend, but a genuine hero whose courage had saved lives at the risk of his own. There's more, Webb said, producing another document that appeared to be a land grant. Upon his honorable discharge in 1876, Sergeant Crowfeather was granted 160 acres of territorial land in recognition of his military service. The grant was made official through the Homestead Act provisions for veterans. Sheriff Morrison leaned forward to examine the land description, his expression growing increasingly serious as he recognized the geographical details. This describes property about 15 miles northeast of here, he said slowly, near the old mining claims that were abandoned when the copper played out. Not abandoned, Webb corrected, with the satisfaction of someone who had discovered a significant truth. Those claims were purchased 3 years ago by a mining syndicate based in Phoenix. They've been extracting silver ore from what they claim is previously unexplored territory. The implications of this revelation struck Dr. Bennett first, his medical training having taught him to recognize symptoms and trace them back to their underlying causes. You're saying that Running Wolf owns land that's currently being mined by someone else? I'm saying that Sergeant Joseph Crowfeather holds legal title to 160 acres of what the Southwestern Mining Consortium has been treating as public land available for private development, Webb confirmed. The mining operation has extracted an estimated $200,000 worth of silver ore from property that legally belongs to him. Margaret Mackenzie felt her breath catch as she began to understand the scope of what Webb was revealing. Running Wolf was not just a displaced veteran deserving of sympathy. He was a property owner whose rights had been systematically violated by people who had assumed his disabilities made him incapable of defending his interests. How did the mining company acquire rights to his land? She asked, her voice tight with indignation. Webb consulted another document, his expression showing the distaste of a bureaucrat who had discovered fraud within his own governmental system. They filed claims based on a declaration that the original grant holder was deceased and the property had reverted to territorial status. The declaration was supported by testimony from sources who claimed to have witnessed Sergeant Crowfeather's death in a skirmish with Mexican raiders 2 years ago. Running Wolf spoke for the first time since Webb had begun his presentation, his voice carrying bitter understanding of the deception that had been perpetrated against him. Dead men own no property. Dead men make no complaints. Dead men are very convenient for people who want what dead men possess. The question, Webb continued, is how Sergeant Crowfeather came to be declared dead when he was very much alive, and how he ended up in a condition that made him unable to defend his property rights. Dr. Bennett's medical training led him to focus on the physical aspects of the mystery. When did your paralysis begin? He asked Running Wolf directly. After I became sick, Running Wolf replied, his memory reaching back to events that had been clouded by pain and confusion. I was living on my land, working a small garden, raising a few horses. Then fever came, weakness, days when I could not stand. When the sickness passed, my legs would not work. Who took care of you during your illness? Webb asked, making notes. As he spoke, Running Wolf's expression grew troubled as he attempted to reconstruct events that had occurred during periods of delirium and semi-consciousness. A man came to help, said he was sent by the territorial government to check on veterans. He brought medicine, food, stayed to help when I was too weak to care for myself. Webb and Sheriff Morrison exchanged glances, both recognizing the pattern of deception that was emerging from Running Wolf's fragmented memories. "Do you remember this man's name?" Morrison asked. "Hutchinson," Running Wolf said after a moment's consideration. "Said his name was Hutchinson. Same man who brought me to your town, told people he found me abandoned." The pieces of the conspiracy fell into place with the satisfying click of a puzzle being solved. Hutchinson had not rescued Running Wolf from abandonment. He had created the abandonment by isolating him from his property during his illness, then transported him far enough away to prevent him from recognizing familiar landmarks or finding his way back to his land. "The paralysis," Dr. Bennett said, his voice carrying the authority of medical diagnosis, "may have been partially psychological. Trauma, combined with isolation and despair, can create symptoms that mimic physical disability. The gradual improvement I've documented suggests that companionship and purpose have been stimulating recovery." Ivy had listened to this entire discussion with growing anger, her 6-year-old sense of justice outraged by the magnitude of the deception that had been practiced against her friend. "They stole his land," she said, with the moral clarity that adults often lost in legal complexities. "They made him sick and stole his land and told everyone he was dead." "That appears to be exactly what happened," Webb confirmed. "The question now is what legal remedies are available to correct this situation." Running Wolf sat in his wheelchair, surrounded by documents that proved his identity, his military service, his property ownership, and the conspiracy that had robbed him of everything he possessed. The validation was gratifying, but it also raised questions about what justice might look like after years of suffering the consequences of other people's greed. "I want my land back," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet determination of someone who had endured enough injustice. "I want these men to answer for what they have done, and I want the world to know that Joseph Crow Feather is not dead, has never been dead, and will not be convenient for anyone's lies anymore." Webb smiled for the first time since entering Dr. Bennett's office, recognizing that he had found exactly the kind of case that could make a territorial official's reputation while serving genuine justice. "Sergeant Crow Feather," he said formally, "it will be my pleasure to help you reclaim everything that was stolen from you." The transformation in Running Wolf was immediate and visible. His posture straightened, his eyes took on a focus that had been absent for months, and his voice carried an authority that reminded everyone present that they were dealing with a decorated war veteran rather than a charity case. "Then let us begin," he said, and for the first time since arriving in Copper Creek, Joseph Crow Feather sounded like a man who expected to win. The Medal of Honor arrived by special courier 3 days after Webb's revelation, delivered in a wooden presentation box that had been stored in territorial archives for over a decade. When Running Wolf opened the box with trembling hands, the bronze medallion caught the afternoon sunlight and seemed to blaze with its own inner fire. The ribbon was faded but intact, and the engraved citation bore witness to courage that transcended the circumstances of his current situation. Ivy sat beside his wheelchair in their customary spot behind the livery stable, but the atmosphere had changed completely since Webb's discoveries. Running Wolf was no longer the broken man who had been auctioned off to the highest bidder. He was Sergeant Joseph Crow Feather, Medal of Honor recipient, legitimate landowner, and victim of a conspiracy that would soon face the full weight of territorial justice. "It's beautiful," Ivy breathed, reaching out to touch the medal's surface with reverent fingers. "You're a real hero." "Heroes are what other people call you after the shooting stops," Running Wolf replied, but his voice carried a pride that had been absent for months. What matters is doing what needs to be done, when doing it might cost you everything. Margaret Mackenzie approached, carrying a basket of food that had become her daily contribution to their meetings. But she paused when she saw the medal gleaming in Running Wolf's lap. The sight of the official recognition transformed her understanding of the man she had come to know through her daughter's friendship, adding historical weight to his personal dignity. "The hearing is set for next Monday," she reported, having just returned from Sheriff Morrison's office, where the legal preparations were taking shape. Webb says representatives from the mining company will be required to attend, along with anyone who has knowledge of the original land claims. Running Wolf nodded, his expression showing the mixture of anticipation and anxiety that comes with approaching vindication after years of injustice. "Will you be there?" he asked Ivy, his question carrying the weight of someone who needed friendly faces during what would surely be a difficult ordeal. "Of course," Ivy replied without hesitation. "You're my friend. Friends stick together when things get scary." The territorial hearing would take place in the largest available building, the First Baptist Church, since no other structure in Copper Creek could accommodate the expected attendance. News of the case had spread throughout the territory, attracting attention from newspapers, territorial officials, and representatives of various mining interests who wanted to understand the legal implications of the precedent being established. Dr. Bennett had spent considerable time documenting Running Wolf's medical recovery, creating a detailed record that would demonstrate the correlation between his improving physical condition and the restoration of his sense of purpose and dignity. The medical evidence would be crucial in establishing the psychological factors that had contributed to his apparent paralysis. "Your mobility has improved dramatically," Dr. Bennett observed during his final examination before the hearing. "I believe you'll be able to stand during testimony, which will have significant impact on how people perceive your condition and capabilities." Running Wolf had indeed been practicing standing and taking short steps with the aid of wooden crutches that the town's carpenter had constructed specifically for his use. The physical therapy was painful and exhausting, but his determination to face his accusers on his feet rather than from a wheelchair drove him to push beyond the limitations he had accepted for so long. "I will stand when I tell them what was stolen from me," he said with quiet determination. "A man's land should be reclaimed by a man who can stand on his own feet." Sheriff Morrison had been working with Webb to gather evidence and prepare witness testimony, a process that had revealed the extent of the conspiracy against Running Wolf. Hutchinson, the trader who had supposedly rescued Running Wolf from abandonment, had disappeared after learning about the investigation, but his connections to the mining consortium were well documented, and his pattern of targeting disabled veterans suggested this was not his first such crime. The evening before the hearing, Running Wolf requested a private moment with Ivy and Margaret at the boarding house. He had never entered their home before, his wheelchair making the steps impossible to navigate, but his improved mobility allowed him to manage the entrance with Margaret's assistance and his wooden crutches. The interior of the Mackenzie boarding house was modest but comfortable, reflecting Margaret's efforts to maintain dignity despite their economic struggles. Running Wolf accepted a seat in the parlor's most comfortable chair, setting his crutches aside and looking around at the domestic scene with something approaching contentment. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, his voice carrying formality that suggested the importance of what he was about to say. "Not just for the auction, not just for the daily visits, but for treating me like a human being when others had forgotten that I was one." Ivy settled on the floor beside his chair, her wooden horse carving clutched in her hands as it had been during many of their conversations. "You don't need to thank us," she said with 6-year-old certainty. "That's what friends do." Nevertheless, Running Wolf continued, "I want you to understand what your friendship has meant to a man who had given up hope. When I came to this town, I believed my life was ending. You showed me that it was only changing. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes as she recognized the depth of gratitude in his words. "You've given us as much as we've given you," she replied. "Ivy has learned things from you that I could never have taught her, about courage, about dignity, about treating people with respect regardless of their circumstances." "Tomorrow will be difficult," Running Wolf acknowledged, his expression growing serious as he contemplated the challenges ahead. "There will be lawyers, officials, people who do not want to admit what they have done. They will try to make me seem less than I am, to justify their actions by diminishing my worth." "You're worth more than all of them put together," Ivy declared, with fierce loyalty. Running Wolf smiled at her protective instinct, but his eyes remained focused on the broader implications of the hearing. "The men who stole from me are not evil in their own minds," he said. "They are practical men who saw opportunity and convinced themselves that taking what belonged to a disabled Apache was not really theft. They will have lawyers, documents, arguments about why their actions were justified. But you have the truth," Margaret pointed out. "You have proof of your service, your land grants, your legal ownership. Surely that matters more than their excuses." "Truth matters," Running Wolf agreed, "but truth must be spoken clearly and powerfully if it is to overcome comfortable lies. I need to be strong tomorrow, not just in my body but in my spirit. I need to speak not just as Joseph Crow Feather, but as all the veterans who have been forgotten, all the disabled who have been dismissed, all the people who have been declared inconvenient by those with more power." The weight of representation clearly pressed on him, and Margaret understood that he was carrying more than just his personal grievances into the hearing. He had become a symbol of justice for people who rarely received it, and the responsibility was both inspiring and daunting. "I've prepared something," he said, reaching into a leather pouch he had brought with him. "Something I want you to keep, regardless of what happens tomorrow." He withdrew a small wooden carving, unlike any of the others he had made for Ivy. This one was an eagle in flight, its wings spread wide and its head turned toward the sky with an expression of absolute freedom. The detail was extraordinary. Each feather individually carved, the bird's talons extended as if it were about to grasp something precious. "This represents the spirit that cannot be caged," he explained, offering the carving to Ivy. "No matter what men do to the body, no matter what they steal or destroy, the spirit can still soar if it chooses to fly." Ivy accepted the eagle carving with the reverence she had learned to show for Running Wolf's gifts, understanding that this piece was different from the others. More personal, more significant, carrying meanings that extended beyond simple craftsmanship. "If something happens to me," Running Wolf continued, "if the hearing goes badly, or if the men who stole from me find other ways to silence me, I want you to remember that friendship like ours is stronger than any injustice. The love between people who choose to care for each other cannot be stolen, cannot be sold, cannot be destroyed by those who deal only in power and money." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Ivy said firmly, but her voice carried a tremor that suggested she was beginning to understand that adults lived in a world where bad things could indeed happen to good people. "Probably not," Running Wolf agreed, his tone gentle but realistic. "But a warrior prepares for all possibilities, and I have been a warrior longer than I have been anything else." Margaret leaned forward in her chair, her expression showing the maternal protectiveness that extended beyond her own daughter, to include this elderly man who had become part of their family. "You won't face tomorrow alone," she promised. "We'll be there, and so will Dr. Bennett, Sheriff Morrison, and anyone else in this town who has learned to see past their own prejudices." "And Mr. Webb," Ivy added, having developed considerable faith in the territorial official's commitment to justice. "He said he's going to make sure everyone knows the truth about what those bad men did to you." Running Wolf nodded, drawing strength from their support, while maintaining the stoic dignity that had carried him through years of hardship. "Then tomorrow we will see whether truth is still powerful enough to overcome comfortable lies, whether justice can still prevail when it faces entrenched interests, and whether one old Apache's life is worth defending in a world that finds it easier to forget than to remember. The evening ended with Running Wolf accepting Margaret's invitation to stay for dinner. The first meal he had shared with a family since losing his own so many years before. As they sat around the small kitchen table, sharing simple food and quiet conversation, the domestic peace felt like a victory already won, regardless of what tomorrow's hearing might bring. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of approaching weather, suggesting that change was coming to Copper Creek in ways that extended far beyond one man's fight for justice. But inside the Mackenzie boarding house, 3 people who had found family in the most unlikely circumstances prepared to face that change together, drawing strength from bonds that no legal proceeding could either create or destroy. When running, Wolf finally returned to his wheelchair and made his way back to the livery stable. He carried with him something he had not possessed since arriving in Copper Creek, the absolute certainty that he was not alone, that his fight was shared by people who cared about him as a person rather than as a problem to be solved. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight he was Joseph Crowfeather, Medal of Honor recipient, friend to a brave little girl and her courageous mother, and a man who had rediscovered reasons to hope for justice in a world that had taught him to expect disappointment. The hearing would determine whether his land could be restored and his dignity officially vindicated, but the friendship that had made that restoration possible was already complete, already victorious, already proof that some victories transcend any courtroom's ability to grant or deny them. The First Baptist Church had never hosted a territorial hearing before, and Preacher Williams had spent considerable time arranging the pews and altar area to accommodate the formal legal proceeding, the wooden gavel that would determine running. Wolf's fate had been borrowed from the county courthouse 2 days' ride away, and its presence on the makeshift judge's bench carried the weight of official authority into a space usually reserved for sermons and hymns. Judge Harrison Whitmore arrived from the territorial capital with the bearing of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected people's lives in permanent ways. His experience included numerous cases involving land disputes, mining claims, and the complex legal issues that arose when territorial expansion encountered existing rights and claims. He understood that this hearing would establish precedents affecting how disabled veterans were treated throughout the territory. Running Wolf entered the church supported by his wooden crutches, his movements slow but deliberate, as he made his way to the witness chair that had been positioned near the altar. The Medal of Honor was pinned to his shirt, its bronze surface catching the morning light that streamed through the church's windows. Ivy and Margaret sat in the front pew, their presence providing moral support that was visible to everyone in the packed sanctuary. Marcus Webb sat at a table laden with documents, his preparation evident in the organized stacks of evidence that would tell the story of conspiracy and theft. Across from him sat 3 lawyers representing the Southwestern Mining Consortium, their expensive suits and confident demeanor suggesting they were accustomed to winning cases through superior resources rather than superior arguments. The lead attorney for the mining company was a man named Charles Bradshaw, whose reputation for aggressive tactics and technical legal arguments had earned him considerable success in territorial courts. His strategy appeared to focus on questioning Running Wolf's mental capacity and legal competency, arguing that his disabilities made him incapable of understanding or managing property rights. "Your Honor," Webb began, his opening statement carrying the moral authority of someone who had uncovered genuine injustice. This case involves the systematic theft of property from a decorated military veteran through a conspiracy designed to take advantage of his temporary illness and isolation. Judge Whitmore nodded for him to continue, his expression showing the judicial neutrality that would be essential for a fair hearing in a case with such clear emotional dimensions. Sergeant Joseph Crowfeather served his country with distinction, for 7 years, earning the Medal of Honor and a land grant in recognition of his service. That service included saving the lives of numerous civilians and soldiers through his courage and knowledge of difficult terrain. Webb lifted running. Wolf's military records, their official seals and signatures providing documentary proof that could not be disputed. These records establish not only his identity, but his legal entitlement to the property that is currently being mined by the defendants without his knowledge or consent. Bradshaw rose to object, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who had used procedural challenges to derail cases before they could reach their substance. Your Honor, before we proceed with testimony about events that allegedly occurred years ago, the court must establish the witness's competency to understand the nature of these proceedings. The objections struck at the heart of the defense strategy, portraying Running Wolf as mentally incompetent due to his disabilities, unable to give reliable testimony about complex legal matters. It was a tactic that had been used successfully against other disabled veterans who lacked the resources to fight back effectively. I'll allow testimony on the witness's current mental state, Judge Whitmore ruled, but the court will make its own determination about competency based on observed behavior during these proceedings. Dr. Bennett was called to testify first, his medical credentials lending scientific authority to his observations about Running Wolf's condition and recovery. He described the correlation between social isolation and psychological symptoms, explaining how companionship and purpose had stimulated dramatic improvements in both mental and physical functioning. In my professional opinion, Dr. Bennett concluded, Sergeant Crow Feather is fully competent to understand legal proceedings and to give reliable testimony about events in his past. His recovery demonstrates that many of his previous symptoms were related to trauma and isolation rather than permanent cognitive impairment. Bradshaw's cross-examination focused on challenging Dr. Bennett's qualifications and suggesting that his medical observations were colored by personal friendship rather than professional objectivity. Doctor, isn't it true that you have no specialized training in psychological disorders or mental competency evaluation? That's correct, Dr. Bennett admitted, but I have 30 years of experience treating patients with various conditions, including veterans suffering from the after-effects of military service and trauma. And isn't it also true that you have developed personal feelings about this case that might affect your professional judgment? Dr. Bennett paused, recognizing the trap, but choosing to answer honestly rather than defensively. I have developed respect for Sergeant Crow Feather as a person, yes, but my medical observations are based on documented improvements in his condition that are measurable and objective. Sheriff Morrison testified next about the circumstances of Running Wolf's arrival in Copper Creek, describing Hutchinson's role and the suspicious aspects of his story about finding an abandoned Apache man. His testimony established the foundation for understanding how the conspiracy had been carried out. Did you have any reason to question Mr. Hutchinson's account at the time? Webb asked. In hindsight, yes, Morrison admitted. But we had a practical problem that needed immediate solution, and questioning the details seemed less important than providing care for someone who appeared to need it. When Running Wolf himself was finally called to testify, the church fell, silent as he made his way slowly to the witness chair, his crutches supporting him but not defining him. His Medal of Honor caught the light as he settled into position, a tangible reminder of the courage and service that had earned him the rights now being contested. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his attention focused entirely on the witness whose testimony would determine the outcome of the case. Please state your full name for the record. Joseph Crow Feather, Running Wolf replied, his voice carrying across the packed church with clarity and dignity. Sergeant, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, United States Army, Medal of Honor recipient and rightful owner of 160 acres of land that was stolen from me through deception and fraud. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war against the comfortable lies that had allowed the theft to continue for years. Bradshaw shifted uncomfortably at his table, recognizing that his client faced a witness who would not be easily intimidated or confused. "Sergeant Crow-Feather," Judge Whitmore said formally, "please tell the court about the events that led to your current situation." Running Wolf straightened in his chair, drew a deep breath, and began to speak with the measured cadence of someone who had been waiting years for the opportunity to tell his story to people with the authority to act on it. Running Wolf's testimony unfolded with the precision of a military report and the emotional weight of a man reclaiming his stolen life. He described his illness, Hutchinson's false kindness, the gradual realization that he had been transported far from his land and declared dead to facilitate its theft. His voice remained steady throughout, but his hands gripped his crutches with the tension of someone confronting years of injustice. "When I recovered enough to understand my situation," he continued, "I was too weak to travel, too isolated to seek help, and too ashamed to believe anyone would listen to a disabled Apache making claims about stolen property." Bradshaw's cross-examination was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective against Running Wolf's consistent, detailed responses. The attorney attempted to portray him as confused about dates and events, but Running Wolf's military training had taught him to observe and remember, precisely skills that served him well under hostile questioning. "Sergeant Crow-Feather," Bradshaw pressed, "how can you be certain of your property boundaries when you admit you were ill and disoriented during the period in question?" "I surveyed that land myself when I first claimed it," Running Wolf replied, with quiet authority. "I know every canyon, every water source, every game trail. A man does not forget the place where he intended to build his future." Webb's final presentation included the original land deed, military discharge papers that had been recovered from territorial archives, and documentation proving that the mining consortium had been operating on property they had no legal right to claim. The evidence was overwhelming, but legal cases sometimes turned on technicalities rather than truth. Judge Whitmore called a brief recess to review the documents, leaving the packed church buzzing with subdued conversations. Ivy slipped from her pew and approached Running Wolf, her small hand finding his larger one, with the confident affection that had characterized their friendship from the beginning. "You did good," she whispered, her voice carrying the absolute faith that children sometimes display in the face of adult uncertainties. "The truth is powerful," Running Wolf replied, "but power is not always enough. Justice requires courage from those who have the authority to grant it." When Judge Whitmore returned, his expression was grave but determined. The weight of establishing territorial precedent was evident in his careful phrasing as he began to deliver his decision. "This court has heard testimony establishing that Sergeant Joseph Crow-Feather is a decorated military veteran who was granted 160 acres of territorial land in recognition of his service to his country. The evidence clearly demonstrates that this property was illegally claimed by the defendants through fraudulent declarations of his death." A murmur rippled through the church as people began to realize the direction of the judge's ruling. Bradshaw shifted in his seat, preparing arguments for an appeal that might delay the inevitable, but could not ultimately prevent it. Furthermore, Judge Whitmore continued, "The court finds that Sergeant Crow-Feather was systematically defrauded through a conspiracy designed to take advantage of his temporary illness and isolation. The actions of Mr. Hutchinson and his associates represent criminal fraud that demands both civil remedy and criminal prosecution." The words fell like hammer blows on the mining company's hopes for continuing their illegal operation. Webb smiled, with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully served justice, while Running Wolf maintained his stoic composure even as vindication washed over him. "Therefore, this court orders the immediate cessation of all mining operations on Sergeant Crow-Feather's property. the return of all extracted materials or their monetary equivalent, and the payment of damages for 3 years of illegal exploitation of his land. Judge Whitmore's gavel came down with finality that echoed through the church like a gunshot. Running Wolf sat perfectly still for a moment, absorbing the reality that his property rights had been restored, his dignity officially vindicated, and his faith in justice ultimately proven correct. Ivy jumped from her pew and ran to him, her arms encircling him in a fierce hug that expressed joy beyond words. Margaret followed more sedately, but with tears streaming down her face, recognizing that she had witnessed something extraordinary, the triumph of truth over comfortable lies, of courage over expedience, of simple human decency over complex legal manipulation. "We won," Ivy announced unnecessarily, her voice carrying throughout the church with the pure happiness of someone who had never doubted the outcome. "Yes," Running Wolf agreed, his own voice thick with emotion that he had held in check throughout the long ordeal. "We won." But as the crowd began to disperse and the immediate celebration faded, everyone understood that the real victory had been achieved months earlier in the dusty lot behind Fletcher's general store, when a 6-year-old girl had raised a small hand and offered $2 crumpled for the friendship of an elderly Apache warrior. The legal vindication was important, the property restoration was significant, and the criminal prosecution of his defrauders would serve justice. But the healing that had made all of this possible had begun with an act of innocent compassion that no court could mandate and no legal proceeding could replicate. Running Wolf looked at Ivy and Margaret, his chosen family, and realized that he had gained far more than the return of stolen land. He had rediscovered hope, purpose, and the fundamental human connection that made all other victories meaningful. Outside the church, the Arizona sun blazed with the intensity that had defined this desert territory for centuries before white men arrived with their laws and their claims and their complicated ideas about justice. But inside the First Baptist Church of Copper Creek, justice had been served with a clarity that even the desert sun could not improve upon. Sergeant Joseph Crow Feather was going home. 6 months after the territorial hearing, the high desert country northeast of Copper Creek had been transformed from an illegal mining operation into something resembling its original natural state. The silver ore had been valuable, but the land itself possessed a beauty that transcended monetary worth. Rolling hills covered with sage and pinon pine, clear streams that ran year-round from mountain springs, and views that stretched to horizons. Unmarked by human ambition, Running Wolf stood on the porch of his reconstructed cabin, his legs now strong enough to support him without assistance, watching Ivy chase butterflies through the wildflower meadow that had reclaimed the scarred earth. Where mining equipment once operated, the wooden eagle he had carved for her perched on the porch railing, its wings spread wide as if preparing for flight over the landscape that had been restored to something approaching its former glory. The settlement they had built together reflected a curious blend of Apache tradition and frontier practicality. Running Wolf's cabin occupied the central position, but Margaret had constructed a smaller dwelling nearby where she operated a school for the few children in the scattered ranching community. The boarding house in Copper Creek had been sold to pay for their relocation, but the decision had been made gladly in exchange for the space and freedom that this remote location provided. Dr. Bennett made the ride from town twice monthly, more as a friend than a physician, though he continued to document Running Wolf's remarkable recovery for medical journals that were interested in the correlation between social connection and physical healing. His reports had attracted attention from military hospitals dealing with disabled veterans, suggesting that Running Wolf's experience might offer insights applicable to other cases. The improvement has been extraordinary, Dr. Bennett noted during his most recent visit, observing Running Wolf's mobility and evident contentment. 6 months ago, you were essentially paralyzed. Now you're doing physical labor that would challenge men half your age. Purpose is powerful medicine, Running Wolf replied, gesturing toward the garden, where he grew vegetables, and the small corral where he trained horses for neighboring ranchers. When a man has reasons to be strong, his body remembers how to be strong. The legal aftermath of the hearing had resulted in significant changes throughout the territory. Hutchinson had been arrested and sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison for fraud, while the mining consortium had paid substantial damages that more than compensated Running Wolf for his years of loss. More importantly, new regulations had been implemented requiring verification of property ownership before mining claims could be approved, preventing similar frauds against other disabled veterans. Marcus Webb had parlayed his successful prosecution of the case into an appointment as Territorial Advocate for Veterans Affairs, a position that allowed him to investigate other suspicious property transfers and ensure that military service records were properly maintained and accessible to those who needed them. His work had already resulted in the restoration of property rights to 3 other veterans who had been similarly defrauded. Sheriff Morrison made the monthly ride to check on their remote settlement, but his visits were more social than official. The isolation that had once made Running Wolf vulnerable to fraud now provided the peace and privacy that allowed their unusual family to flourish without the complications of small-town gossip and social expectations. "How's the school coming along?" Morrison asked Margaret during his latest visit, dismounting his horse and accepting the coffee that had become part of their routine. 7 students now, Margaret replied, with the satisfaction of someone who had found meaningful work. Ages 6 to 14, from ranches within riding distance. They come 3 days a week for reading, writing, and arithmetic, but they also learn Apache traditions from Running Wolf, tracking, plant identification, weather prediction, and stories. And I carry more wisdom than most textbooks. The educational arrangement had evolved naturally from Running Wolf's interactions with Ivy, expanding to include other children whose parents recognized the value of learning skills that formal schooling rarely provided. His teaching methods emphasized observation, patience, and respect for natural systems that supported life in harsh environments. Ivy had become the bridge between worlds, equally comfortable with McGuffey readers and Apache legends, arithmetic, problems and tracking skills, Sunday school lessons and ancient stories about coyotes and eagles, and the spirits that moved through desert landscapes with purposes beyond human understanding. Her education was unconventional but comprehensive, preparing her for a life that would require adaptation to changing circumstances. On this particular afternoon, as autumn light painted the surrounding hills in shades of gold and amber, the 3 members of their chosen family sat together on Running Wolf's porch, sharing the quiet contentment that comes from surviving hardship and building something good from the wreckage of previous losses. "I've been thinking," Running Wolf said, his voice carrying the reflective tone that preceded his most important observations, "about the difference between what was stolen from me and what was given to me." Ivy looked up from the wooden animals. She was arranging in elaborate patterns, her attention drawn by the serious note in his voice. Margaret paused in her mending, recognizing that Running Wolf was preparing to share insights that had been developing over months of healing and reflection. "They stole my land, my health, my years of peace," he continued. "Those were valuable things, and getting them back was important. But what you gave me was more valuable than what they stole. Hope when I had given up hope, friendship when I had forgotten what friendship felt like, reasons to heal when healing seemed impossible." The wooden eagle on the porch railing seemed to nod in the evening breeze, its carved wings catching the last rays of sunlight that illuminated the meadow, where butterflies danced among wildflowers that had grown from soil, once torn apart by greed, but now restored by patience and care. "What they stole, the courts could return," Running Wolf said, reaching for Ivy's small hand and Margaret's work-worn fingers. "What you gave me, no court could order and no law could guarantee. That's the difference between justice and love, between legal victory and human healing. As the desert stars emerged overhead, brilliant in the clear air far from town lights, their small settlement represented something larger than individual recovery or personal justice. It was proof that human connection could overcome systematic cruelty, that innocence could triumph over experience, and that some victories were measured not in acres reclaimed or damages awarded, but in the simple fact that broken people could heal each other through the radical act of choosing to care. The friendship that had begun with $2 crumpled and a child's instinctive compassion had grown into something that would outlast any legal decision, survive any economic hardship, and continue to generate hope long after the specific injustices that had brought them together were forgotten by everyone except those whose lives had been transformed by the healing power of unlikely love.